Welcome to episode 73 of the How to Japanese podcast. I'm Daniel Morales from howtojapanese.com, and it's February 2026. Otsukaresama deshita. We made it. I'm sending out the newsletter and podcast early this month because I have family visiting soon and didn't want to be crunched during the last week of the month once they head back to the US. As I noted last month, this is a shorter post about a specific phrase, and that phrase is hajimete iwaremashita. This is a great example of the passive form in Japanese. And let me give that phrase one more time. Hajimete iwaremashita. The verb you becomes iimasu in the distal form and then iwaremasu in the Japanese passive, and essentially means to be said. Although it's never to be said in isolation, of course. You have to consider it in context. Something specific is said by someone. These people are always present, even if they're not explicitly stated. So the real translation, at least into English, is someone said something to me. But Japanese expresses this by saying, literally, I was said, and then kind of implied in parentheses, invisible, is something by someone. I was said something by someone, and the something by someone is in parentheses. I gave the English here, I realize, in the past tense because that's the phrase I wrote about this month, hajimete iwaremashita. That's the past tense of iwaremasu. I'm sure that I'd heard this phrase a long time ago at some point, but I never really clocked it as a useful phrase until a couple years ago when I was eating out at one of my favorite local restaurants. I go into more detail about this particular restaurant in the newsletter, so please go read that. But basically, we've gotten obsessed with this local teppanyaki place that doesn't do a typical kind of meat-forward teppanyaki that you think of when you think of like teppanyaki in somewhere like Kobe, which is rife with these little Kobe beef teppanyaki spots. This place near me, they have very simple dishes, generally just kind of one vegetable or meat. They've got a row of appetizers that are maybe, 6 to 8 different appetizers, and then 6 to 8 different small dishes and a couple of rice dishes. If this was a U.S. restaurant, I'd say they do small plates, but the menu is even smaller, I think, than a small plates menu in the U.S. One friend we brought with us was super impressed with the restaurant's operation, which is focused and simple and run by just 2 young men. She was also impressed with the design, which is clean and modern. So at one point, when the front of house staff came over, one of the guys works front of the house, and the other guy works the grill. Our friend said that they had samurai damashi, that samurai spirit. Our friend is Japanese, so this didn't kind of come across strangely, or at least as strange as it could have, had it been a compliment coming from someone who's not Japanese. The staff's response was really interesting, and this is where I heard this phrase. He said, "Samurai damashi hajimete iwaremashita." Samurai damashi hajimete iwaremashita. I felt like this was a nice, natural, smooth way to respond to this unique compliment. It wasn't exactly a deflection, I don't think, but you could use it as a deflection for an awkward or kind of uncomfortable compliment. It means literally, that's the first time, hajimete, I've been told that, iwaremashita. Maybe in more natural English, you could say, that's the first time anyone said that to me. You could use it to gracefully accept a nice compliment with your tone, which I think is what the staff did here. You just have to say, hajimete iwaremashita. If somebody compliments you, you can kind of shake off the compliment, accept it gracefully, and say, no one's ever said that about me before. Thank you, But you could also use it to deflect it. Say somebody says, I can't even think of a good example right now, but if they say some kind of uncomfortable compliment and you say, hajimete iwaremashita, and kind of laugh it off a little bit, show a little bit of mild surprise rather than an insulted tone, to show that you're not used to hearing it, which maybe is a nice, kind way to say, what the hell, rather than saying, what the hell. I also think this phrase is a great phrase to help new students get a better grasp of how exactly the Japanese passive form works. We often need phrases like this as non-native speakers because Japanese expressions often take a very different path to communicate than English does. But once you get the passive form down, it really becomes second nature along with other forms such as, giving and receiving, I think, which can be a real maze at first. There are two other examples that I mention in this month's blog post of two other examples of the passive form. One is yoku iwaremasu, which is very simple and kind of complementary and opposite to hajimete iwaremashita. This is a phrase that if you get told something all the time, like if somebody's always saying, oh, you've got really good Japanese, you could say, yoku iwaremasu. People say that all the time, yoku iwaresu. That is often said about me is literally what this means. Literally, I guess I am often said that by other people, something like that. And this would be a kind of joking way to accept a compliment. Yoku iwaremasu. Something, if you wanted to joke about something that actually is said about you all the time, or even something that's not said about you all the time, this would be another fine way to deflect an awkward compliment. And if you laughed at it with the right tone and said, yoku iwaremasu, then I think people would get that you are kind of laughing at that aspect of the compliment. I wrote about this phrase in my August 2011 article in the Japan Times about universal humor and ways that you can use self-deprecating humor to your advantage in Japanese. Again, this phrase, like hajimete iwaremashita, very versatile in terms of being able to use it to deflect or accept a compliment in a funny way. The other pattern that I wrote about way back in 2008, originally for the Fukushima Jet newsletter, which I then turned into one of my first blog posts, is kanchou sareta. This was a useful phrase for elementary school teachers because for whatever reason at the time, kids seemed to be obsessed with giving a quote-unquote, I guess, finger enema by poking you in the butt. Kanchou literally means enema. And I don't know if this has changed over the past 10 years, but it does seem like enema and kanchou humor has maybe dropped off a little bit, but this could just be me being away from elementary schools for a while now. At any rate, looking at the phrase grammatically, kanchou sareta, it literally means I was enemaed, presumably by someone. So putting this into natural English, I think you could translate it, at least functionally, as we think about it maybe in this elementary school environment. Someone poked me in the butt is literally kind of what it would mean. There's no literal enemas going on here. Obviously, that would be a little bit strange. Obviously, a specific person is doing this, but I use the word someone. If you're using this phrase, kanchou sareta, to report what happened to you to someone, and you're leaving out the perpetrator, then you can kind of think about it in terms of that maybe that person isn't important. What's more important is what happened. You're just saying, oh, I'm surprised that this happened. And in this case, you can use someone or some kid in English. Some kid poked me in the butt in Japanese. You don't have to mention anyone at all. You can communicate exactly what happened without doing that. You could also very easily mark who the perpetrator is with the particle ni. So you could say, Taro ni kanchou sareta. So Taro poked me in the butt. Very easy to add that to this phrase as well, if that's the information you're trying to convey. It really is a matter of strategy here. You need to think about, okay, what am I trying to convey to somebody? Is it just the surprise that this happened to me, or am I trying to narc out Taro here and let the teacher know that they need to go get Taro under control, in which case you'd want to mark taro with ni here, and then you would specifically say in the English rather than someone, you'd say taro. And this got me thinking a little bit in terms of the role passive plays with pronouns. You have these words someone, everyone, no one, and anyone. These words are often just implied in Japanese. Yoku iwaremasu, for example, the phrase we looked at earlier, could in English be everyone says that. This everyone isn't specified in Japanese, but it's implied through the yoku, which means frequently, right? In English, though, we need to specify everyone, or it might end up sounding awkward without a pronoun here, or some kind of person. Hajimete言われました could be no one's ever said that. You could kind of invert that rather than saying this is the first time anyone's ever said that. In that case, you have anyone, or you could invert it and say no one's ever said that to me before. These kind of faceless general pronouns in English are just implied in Japanese, often with the passive form, which makes them particularly useful. And once you gain control of them, you're able to convey a ton of information in really small, concise packages. And then once you get a couple of these down under your belt, like maybe hajimete iwaremashita and yoku iwaremasu, the rest of them will really kind of fall into place. And I think you'll start to be more comfortable with the passive form in general, which is then going to give you access to a huge range of language that you wouldn't have otherwise. So that's what was in the newsletter this month. Just a quick one, as I mentioned. It's going to be another quick podcast. I've got a couple iro points and a quick recommendation. But again, I'm trying to get this recorded in between naps that my kid is taking. The iro. I've purposely not given away the specific restaurant either in the newsletter or here in the podcast. I do show a photo of it. If you are a avid geolocator, maybe you can find it that way. I didn't want to risk the over-tourism gods and draw too much attention to the place. Not that I really have a big readership that would cause any problems, but it's just not worth the risk. But if you do live in Osaka and are curious, email me and I'd be glad to share it. I also mentioned my realtor in the newsletter, and if you happen to be apartment hunting in Osaka, I'd be glad to introduce you to that realtor as well. He doesn't charge any fees for his side of the work, introducing you to apartments, and he's put me in 2 really nice spots. So let me know if you do need an introduction there. The other iro point I have is that Murakami has a new novella out in the March edition of Shincho. If you want a copy, I would move really quickly on it, because it sells out pretty quickly. A lot of I was looking for a back issue, and they're already gone, and they're going for somewhat high prices on Mercari, so I'm still trying to land a back issue there. It's the 4th installment in his Kaho series with the title Kaho and the Motorcycle Man and Scarlett Johansson. It's a long one. It's 250 manuscript pages, 85 pages in the Japanese, and I think probably would work out to somewhere around 50,000 words. The first story in this series was okay. It was nice and short. The second one was called Musashi Sakai, the Musashi Sakai Anteater. I just finished it after starting it last year, and it was pretty bad. And so I don't have my hopes up for this one. I also realized there was one last November called Kaho and the Termite Queen, which I need to track down. But this is not Murakami at his finest form. But if you're a Murakami nerd like me, it might be worth checking out. I also want to say thanks to the reader Koi, who wrote in last month and suggested a replacement pronoun. They suggested that sensei might be a good replacement pronoun, and I think I'd agree. I think this would also classify words like senpai and kohai as replacement pronouns as a sort, as they kind of refer to someone's role rather than the actual person. Although I'm still curious whether there's any pronouns that kind of refer more to a group rather than an individual. I feel like there must be some out there that I just can't think of right now. Let me know if you think of any others, and I'll report back if I find any. And finally, my recommendation for the month. I know at some point I promised these recommendations would be tourist recommendations, but I've been a little at a loss for what to recommend lately, given how stationary and indoor I've been lately. But I like to give timely recommendations whenever possible, and that's what I've done this month. But before I give this recommendation, let me promise that I have actual tourist recommendations for the March and April podcast already lined up. I went ahead and thought through what I could introduce, really sat for a minute and thought about what might be interesting for people. And so I've got notes for that and plan to write those up. And they are, I think, some really nice recommendations. None of them are really like inside baseball dive type stuff, but I would say most of them are pretty well known, but they are great. And at least one of them, I think, will be a real diamond in the rough that I learned about through a friend. So stay tuned for that. This month, however, I'd like to recommend a cookbook author, Hasegawa Akari. I don't know how well known she is in English, but it looks like almost all the hits for her on Google in English are AI translations of some sort, unfortunately, and there are only around 2,000 hits for her name in English. So I think it's safe to say that she isn't very well known, but she's extremely popular in Japan. She has nearly 950,000 followers on Twitter and dozens of different cookbooks. My wife is a huge fan of her, and that's how I learned about her, because my wife is always cooking her food. And I've become more acquainted with her recipes during my paternity leave because I've been doing most of the cooking. I have my own repertoire in the kitchen, but it's largely vegetarian recipes. I grew up vegetarian, some Mexican food, and then some other random tricks I picked up from TikTok and online. And TikTok recipes, I'm more and more convinced it's a psyop to keep Americans fat and happy by teach them how to make baked goods that are super delicious. But I also learned, I would say, there's a good contingent of the Instant Pot community on there, and I'm an Instant Pot maniac. One of the first things I did was get one of those off Jimuti once I moved to Osaka. Jimuti, I'm sure I've talked about in the past. It's the easiest way to get rid of things in Japan. If you want to get rid of something without paying to get rid of it, put it on Jimuti. You can also find some things there, and happen to find an Instant Pot for a really good price, not too far from me in Osaka. But a lot of this cooking is not Japanese food, and my Japanese wife does not always appreciate my Instant Pot lentil soups. She'd rather have something more familiar. And so I've been cooking out of Hasegawa Akari's cookbooks, and they are pretty revelatory, to be honest. I'd say most of her recipes have a maximum of 4 ingredients and generally only take 15 to 20 minutes to make. For example, she has a soy milk soup that is literally just soy milk, tofu, and shio kombu. And that's it. You don't even have to boil it, because if you boil it, then the soy milk kind of curdles. So you kind of bring it up to a very light simmer, and then add in the tofu and the shio kombu, and that's it. She has a gyudon recipe that is basically beef and dashi, I think, maybe some onions. I can't remember exactly. You can't really go wrong with any of her cookbooks, and a lot of her recipes are available online for free. The other day I had to run out for an appointment and needed to think up like one more dish for dinner. So I Googled takikomi gohan and Hasegawa Akari, and I found an awesome recipe. I found like 3 or 4 recipes that she has for takikomi gohan. And I love takikomi gohan. For anyone who isn't aware, takikomi gohan is when you add things to the rice cooker along with the rice. And generally there's a setting on your rice cooker for takikomi gohan, and it will end up cooking things longer, which is needed if you're adding something like meat to the rice cooker, because you want to make sure the meat is cooked through all the way. But if you're just adding, like in this case, tofu and shirasu, which is a type of small little fish, then you can probably just run it on the regular setting. But these takikomi recipes can be any kind of combination of meat or veggies. A classic one is tori gohan of some variety, which usually has carrots, gobo, and chicken, and is flavored with soy sauce, dashi, and sake. Ajinomoto on their website has a recipe that also includes shimeji and aburaage, and I will link that in the newsletter and Hasegawa-san has a bunch of really creative versions. And the one I made essentially flavors the rice with a few tablespoons of sake, salt, and then you fill up to the measure with water, and then you plop a block of tofu on it and surround it with shirasu, and that's it. When the rice is finished cooking, you can add in some chopped komatsuna, which is Japanese mustard leaves, mix the rice, and that's it. The result is a really interesting takikomi that has some extra protein from the tofu and also some veggies from the komatsuna, which have a really interesting, like, kind of sharp flavor, maybe not so extreme as mustard leaves, but close to it. I think you could also leave out the shirasu if you're not a fan of little fish. She also has recipes that she posts directly to Twitter. Unfortunately, she's not on any other platform yet. Actually, she might be on Instagram. I don't know if she probably posts her recipes there, but Twitter seems to be where she keeps a lot of her recipes. If you're looking for another interesting takikomi gohan recipe, search for her mozzarella and tomato takikomi gohan. You basically put a tomato and a block of burrata mozzarella cheese, although I don't know if I used the real burrata. I used the cheap craft burrata that they sell all over the place in Japan. And then you run that, and that's essentially it. And it turns into this. Oh, and you add namahamu. That, all those three things, and it turns rice into this cheesy tomato ham, like amazing sticky rice. Incredible. So if you're still on Twitter, God help you, but follow Hasegawa Akari, and she's got a lot of her recipes there. Also, I'd recommend just picking up some of her cookbooks, whatever happens to be cheapest, on Mercari or Amazon. I checked. The Mercari discount doesn't seem to be too substantial at this point, so this might be a case where you could find a better deal by going to an actual used bookstore like Book Off to see what they have. Speaking of Book Off, I picked up a great rice cooker cookbook from Book Off a few years ago, and I'm still using the cornbread recipe included. I know I mentioned this online at some point. I may have even said it in the podcast. I can't remember. But if you're not using your rice cooker to make cornbread, you're only using your rice cooker to like 70% of its true capacity. It's kind of like how humans are only using, right, like 60% of our brain capacity at any given time. Like your rice cooker, you can use it to its full capacity, but you have to be making cornbread in it because it's incredible. So order some cornmeal, find a recipe, and you can have a really solid cornbread in 45 minutes with about 5 minutes of prep. And that's all I've got for you. That's my recommendation. I hope you enjoy the newsletter and the blog post, and enjoy the rest of the month, and we'll see you in March.